Hello, you beautiful individuals. As I said, we would be doing the second part of Mr. Beat's Ohio and Pennsylvania compared, this time without such a long intro. So let's go.
In 1655, the Dutch took over future southeastern Pennsylvania, but within a couple decades, the English had full control of it. Meanwhile, modern day western Pennsylvania and Ohio were claimed by France as part of New France. On March 4th, 1681, Charles II of England granted a dude named William Penn the province of Pennsylvania.
And he founded it, which, people from here and that have studied America at all will know, as a religious freedom kind of place, which, to a sense, that's sort of what the whole of the colonies here were about, but it was a very big deal there, even though now Ohio and Pennsylvania are obviously dominantly ran by one religion, essentially. Um, yeah, it's just it's interesting. You don't so as you mentioned before, you have a lot of Amish in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but you also have a lot of Mennonite, which kind of the same thing, but not. And even though you have a lot of them, I mean, they're still you can kind of tie that to Christianity, obviously, and you do get like a fair amount of variety when it comes to theism here, but it's definitely not as diverse as I'm sure he originally planned it. But maybe not. Maybe that's what you know. I'm sure he had his own biases and probably just really wanted to see his religion prosper.
To settle debt that he owed to William's father. Hey, Charles even named it after his dad. Dang. Sylvania, by the way, is Latin for woodlands. William, who, by the way, was embarrassed by the new name of his colony, founded it as a place of religious freedom that mostly attracted Quakers, Germans, Scots, Irish frontiersmen, and others fleeing religious persecution and wars. Penn today is also known for his
Now, I will say this though, even though it's not, I guess, that diverse, if I mean it is still, and I feel here more than other places, it's a lot more accepted if you're different. It obviously depends where you go in the states and in the particular state that you're in, but even from, I mean, I grew up in a very small area, very conservative Christian. They still wouldn't have, I don't know, held you accountable or persecuted you for a different religion. Yeah, obviously you might get some weird looks, but other than that, I mean, it's a pretty tolerant place, even the country. It definitely depends on where you go, though. I will leave it at that.
fair treatment of American Indian tribes who lived in the colony. He founded Pennsylvania's capital, Philadelphia, in 1682. Philadelphia would quickly become a major port and commercial city. Throughout the 1700s, more and more colonists would move further west, encroaching on both American Indian claims and French claims. The British called the area west of Pennsylvania, quote, Ohio country. The name Ohio comes from the Seneca word Ohio, which translates to Great River. What great river were they referring to? The Ohio River, of course.
Of course, the mighty Ohio River. Even though I didn't grow up on the river, you still obviously learn a lot about it, and I've drove over it on bridges and on it with boats countless times. But anyway, so even though people, I think that kind of gets maybe not misconstrued, but just like looked at a little wrong. So obviously Pennsylvania, essentially the center of, the United States at the time. I mean, it's it was where it was founded, essentially, Philadelphia, um, where the rebellion started, kind of. But Ohio still has a lot of history that goes back just as long. Because, I mean, like you said, even though the settlers were just starting to encroach, there were still some out here, and there were French and obviously Indians. So you still had communities out here, just not big ones, and you still have a lot of history here, and towns that, like the one town, Malvern, that I grew up near, It was founded in 1806, I believe, and I am just going off the top of my head. But the county that it's in wasn't founded until, or I guess kind of seceded from the 5 counties around it. Carroll wasn't founded until like the 1820s of some sort. And it's the same thing, like even that town Malvern, before it was Malvern, it was 2 other towns. It was Lodi and Troy. And they were kind of split down the middle. And eventually it actually became kind of big because they had a lot of brick and stuff. There's actually brick there that was made there still on like the Brickyard 400, for NASCAR and various other places all around the world, of course. But
Anyway, a bunch of folks from Virginia created the Ohio Company to settle Ohio country and trade with American Indian tribes there. The problem was France was already there, yo. However, the British won what became known as the French and Indian War.
Or the 7 Years' War, I believe, all over the rest of the world. But yeah, brutal war. I mean, a lot more fighting in Ohio in this war than the Revolution, which was, a lot more in Pennsylvania and for the Revolution as opposed to the French Indian War. Still just a brutal war overall, and you had Indians siding with both sides, and yeah, it was rough.
And then all of Pennsylvania and Ohio country were now part of Great Britain. During the years between the French and Indian War and the American War of Independence, Pennsylvania's borders changed a few times. Famously, Jeremiah Mason and Charles Dixon drew up the Mason-Dixon line, which officially became the southern border, and over time, an informal boundary between free states in the north and slave states in the south. Ohio country never had many slaves, but it did have a lot of violence and turmoil in the years between the French and Indian War and the American War of Independence. But during the American War of Independence, Pennsylvania saw much more violence and turmoil. Pennsylvania, well, Philadelphia specifically, was where the new country of the United States began, where the First and Second Continental Congresses met, and where the Declaration of Independence was signed. In addition to Philadelphia, Lancaster and York even temporarily served as capitals during the war. After independence was secured, the Congress of the Confederation continued to meet in Philadelphia, and it remained the country's capital for a few years. That Congress of the Confederation created the Northwest Territory in 1787, and a dude named Rufus Putnam led a group of Revolutionary veterans to settle in Ohio the next year. Marietta, Ohio became the first European-American permanent U.S. settlement in Northwest Territory.
And note that word permanent, because obviously there were settlements here already, just that was the first permanent, European one. And yeah, he was the first, I guess you could say, but wasn't the last by any means. A lot of people after him started coming here as well. I believe Carrollton's actually named, like Carroll County, and there's a town, as I mentioned, Carrollton. I believe it's actually named after George Carroll. I think he had something to do in like South Carolina or North Carolina. I should look it up, but not interested right now. But anyway.
Many American Indian tribes still lived out there, and treaties were broken as they were pushed further and further west due to American encroachment on their lands. During the Northwest Indian War of 1785 to 1795, a confederation of tribes united to fight the Americans and their American Indian allies. That confederation of tribes lost and had to give up lots of territory, including most of modern-day Ohio. As I hinted at earlier, Pennsylvania was one of the first states in the Union, but that didn't mean it didn't also have some chaos during those years. In the early 1790s, a bunch of farmers in western Pennsylvania organized to not pay the federal tax on certain alcoholic beverages, even
rebellion?
when federal authorities showed up in person trying to collect them. This became known as the Whiskey Rebellion, and it only ended when freaking President George Washington himself and 15,000 soldiers showed up to put it down. By the end of 1801, Ohio's population had swelled to 45,000, and it prepared for a path to statehood. When it did become a state, 14 months later, it rejected slavery, and for many decades afterward, runaway slaves would cross the Ohio River into Ohio as they escaped the South. 45,000 people? That's cute. Around that time, Pennsylvania had around 650,000.
And that just goes to show, obviously, the main difference. I mean, even though yes, there were settlements and people here, a lot more over in Pennsylvania, especially the eastern side. And to the slavery part, so do understand too that all right, so you may have heard something along the lines of the South, the Civil War wasn't about slavery; it was about states' rights, which okay, you can kind of argue, I guess, but it's the states' rights to own slaves and to expand the institution that is slavery. And now the South, even though yes, like West Virginia, even and especially Kentucky, you can definitely consider that the South, but they were more Confederate or Southern border states. Like they didn't have as big of a stake in the game of slavery as like the cotton states did. After the cotton gin being invented and booming that economy and that industry. Yeah, so you can sort of argue it for the border states somewhat, but essentially, at the end of the day, the Confederate ideal and the reason that they wanted to secede was because they wanted to expand the institution of slavery. They actually wanted to go down into Mexico, Central America, even Southern America, and expand it down there onto the Caribbean islands. And yeah, so I don't know.
Thousand people and was the second largest state in the Union by population, really having a strong influence on the rest of the country. Over the following decades, only New York would dominate more. In fact, only New York had more electoral votes than Pennsylvania between the years of 1796 all the way up to 1960. From 1811 to 1813, Ohio found itself impacted by Tecumseh's War between Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his Confederacy and the United States.
If you either aren't from here or just maybe are too young and aren't, learning this part of history yet, you really should look into it. Or if you just haven't heard of it, Tecumseh's War is fascinating. He was a very interesting character. Not saying I agree or disagree with why they did what they did, but I get it, and he's definitely really interesting and a lot of cool history, legends, stories to come out of that one.
It overlapped with the War of 1812 with the British. After it was all over, pretty much every American Indian tribe had lost control of the Great Lakes region, and things calmed down in both states over the next several decades, until the American Civil War, that is. At that time, both Pennsylvania and Ohio were the second and third largest states in the country by population. Both stayed with the Union, of course, and played critical roles in the war, and critical Union leaders came from both states. While Ohio didn't see much action during that war, Pennsylvania was where the biggest, bloodiest, and most famous battle took place, the Battle of Gettysburg.
And Ohio may not have seen a lot of action as far as battling in Ohio, but they still had a lot of troops battling elsewhere,
which we now see as a major turning point of the Civil War. For the rest of the 1800s, industrialization dramatically changed both states, and both became economic powerhouses that most of the rest of the country came to depend on. Between the Civil War and the end of the 1800s, the population of both states doubled, and that rapid growth continued for the first half of the 1900s. Since the 1960s, the growth has cooled off as many factories in both states have shut down. Hence, the aforementioned term Rust Belt. However, the economies of both today have diversified quite a bit and have attracted a lot of business opportunities due to a lower cost of living compared to other places in the country. Although, according to Forbes magazine, Pennsylvania is currently a better state for business. Although it obviously varies from city to city, overall, Ohio has a lower cost of living than Pennsylvania. Ohioans do pay more in taxes overall. That said, Pennsylvania has the highest gas tax in the country. Okay, let's see what other differences. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why comparing they are very close to kind of apples to apples. I would say the thing that differs Pennsylvania is that eastern side. If they didn't have that, or yeah, honestly, if they didn't have that, I think them in Ohio would be almost indistinguishable. I mean, it definitely it boosts obviously population and just diversifies the landscape and the culture and everything.
Yeah, well, this surprised me a bit. Pennsylvania is bigger, but just by about 9%. Ohio's population
Huh.
is.
That I did not know, and that is very interesting. I mean, a few things I definitely didn't know throughout this. But yeah, I didn't. Pennsylvania just seems significantly bigger. I guess it's just that length. That's bizarre.
A little bit more spread out. Pennsylvania's is more in the eastern and western parts. I'm sure the mountains have a lot to do with it. Pennsylvania definitely has more mountains than Ohio. The Appalachians run right through it. Driving across the state on Interstate 80 is one of the most scenic stretches of interstate in the country. Most of the state is.
It really is. I mean, it Ohio and Pennsylvania, but especially Pennsylvania. I mean, beautiful, beautiful state.
Rugged in one way or the other, whereas parts of Ohio are fairly flat, relatively speaking. While both get plenty of precipitation, Pennsylvania gets a bit more overall. Pennsylvania has more residents who were born in a foreign country. Pennsylvania has a higher median household income. It also has a lower poverty rate, or at least it did back in 2019. However, Ohio has a lower violent crime rate.
That surprises me, actually. That surprises me quite a lot. I get they have Philadelphia and obviously Pittsburgh, but man, that really shocks me. Because, I mean, you know, Cleveland and even Canton and Stark County in general, kind of known for that in a sense. Columbus, really, I mean, they have a fair amount too. Like, wow, that definitely surprises me.
More Pennsylvanians have college degrees, although Ohio spends more per student on education. More Pennsylvanians are members of a union. Ohio borders 5 states. Pennsylvania borders 6. The southern border of Ohio is the mighty Ohio River, and the northern border of both states is the aforementioned Lake Erie.
One second, let me back up just a tiny bit.
States. Pennsylvania borders 6. The southern.
Just wanted to take a look at this real quick. So, like I said, I grew up around here in Carroll County. So there's actually the Sandy Beaver Canal runs through Carroll County. It did. I mean, now it's just a kind of a little river stream in some places. But you can actually take it to the Tuscaroras. You do have to get out a little bit, and you know, you would have to carry your boat over a couple things, canoe, whatever, kayak thing. And you can actually take this all the way down the Muskingum, all the way down to the Ohio, all the way to the Mississippi and to the Gulf. And I know someone that did, and astonishing feat, honestly.
Border of Ohio is the mighty Ohio River, and the northern border of both states is the aforementioned Lake Erie. Pennsylvania, just barely though. This 300 square mile northwestern section of the state is known as the Erie Triangle. It originally was disputed land. New York and even Connecticut and Massachusetts all made claims on it, but ultimately the federal government took over the area and sold it to Pennsylvania so that the state would have access to a freshwater port on Lake Erie.
Which is definitely fair. I mean, especially in those days, that's very important. And even now. But yeah, that part, Erie, PA, brutal winters.
Yeah, anyway, the Delaware River makes up the eastern border of Pennsylvania. Ohio has one more national park than Pennsylvania. Yeah, Pennsylvania doesn't have a national park, but it has more historical landmarks. 8 American presidents were born and or spent most of their life in Ohio. You know who else is from Ohio? Geography Joe, who is from Cleveland, actually. And this is actually a collaboration with Geography Joe. He has just released a video about East Cleveland, and it's on his channel right now. Go check it out.
I have not seen that, but I'm gonna, if I remember, I'm gonna link that because I want to watch it mostly.
This one and stuff. Now, Ohioans might disagree with this, but Ohio has better roads over.
I agree, but, and I don't know if he says this, I would imagine by an extremely small margin. Now, again, I don't know what they're classifying. If you're saying how maybe Pennsylvania has like more dirt roads and stuff like that, and okay, but if you're talking like road condition, like asphalt, pavement, you know, potholes, I can't imagine it's much different.
Overall. And let's face it, Ohio also has a cooler, much more unique flag. It's
Literally the coolest state flag there is, so fight me.
It's the only American flag that's not rectangular. I'm sorry, Pennsylvania. Ohio has the world's largest cuckoo clock, drumsticks, and basket.
So I have been to all three of these, especially here as a kid. That's like down near Amish country and stuff where, well, we call it Amish country, but kind of more modernized ones where they make a fairly hefty profit, which makes sense. This, drive by it constantly. I want to say it was a business, and then I think they tried to turn it into a few different things. And if you're from Ohio, I'm sure you've seen, oh, they're finally tearing it down or burning it or something crazy, and it's never true. I don't see it going anywhere unless it has to for whatever safety reason, but it's just one of those weird things.
Although that basket is just a building. But there's also this basket. But Pennsylvania has some really big Big Macs in its Big Mac Museum in North Huntingdon. And several Pennsylvania...
Did not know there was a Big Mac museum, and that's doesn't surprise me, but still very odd.
Pennsylvania towns, they celebrate Halloween earlier than October 31st. Pennsylvania has Old Forge pizza. Ohio has Steubenville-style pizza. Convenience...
That's debatable. See, the thing with Ohio and Pennsylvania both, maybe, now Pennsylvania probably will have more of an identity with it, but for the most part, they are both crossover flyover states. So you have major influence, especially from Chicago, New York, Boston, and obviously even from out in LA and stuff, like everywhere. It's a converging point. I mean, where I grew up, by a fair amount of, major and international airports, you can't look up in the sky and not see multiple planes, really high up flying. And it's not only a crossover point, it's a layover point of two very popular ones. So you get a lot of influence from everywhere. Now that is, I guess, the thing, but I wish he would have talked more about, like, Cincinnati chili or something, but I get it.
The stores in Pennsylvania actually have good food. There is a bit of a civil war between phenomenal convenience stores in Pennsylvania. In the west, Sheetz dominates, and the east, Wawa.
So I've seen a Wawa here and there, but Sheetz is actually, I don't know if we have any of those here. I'm assuming no. I haven't seen one here. Have seen them over in PA. Sheetz we do have here, and if you haven't eaten at a Sheetz, like, I know it's weird to say because it's a gas station, but seriously, pretty decent food. I mean, worth it to try at least. Like, I'm not saying it's out of this world, greatest food you're ever going to have, but the customization and the options are surprising, and it's not bad. It really isn't. And they're usually massive, convenience stores, so there's a lot of option as far as other things.
Dominates. Ohio has some Sheetz stores, but not Wawa stores.
Okay,
but it does have Casey's, so I guess that makes up for it.
Also, we have probably more Speedway, I would imagine, which that's kind of on the same par, but definitely not as big or upscaled.
The differences between the two states are because of eastern Pennsylvania existing. Eastern Pennsylvania actually has more in common with the East Coast states. I mean, Philly has more in common with New York and Washington, D.C. than the three major Ohio cities, and even Pittsburgh. Central and western Pennsylvania definitely are much more similar to Ohio. I'll conclude by showing you this map. As you can see, both are not that far from the exciting East Coast, yet have quite a bit lower cost of living. Not just the East Coast. Former Ohio Governor John Kasich once said, quote, "We're within 600 miles of 60% of America." And he was right.
Yeah, actually, I don't know where I heard it, but something like, if you had a bomb in Columbus with a 500-mile blast radius, whatever, theoretically, that would take out 50% of America, because that's where, it makes sense. And we do have a low cost of living. I mean, it's not saying that things still aren't expensive, but I mentioned that in the first part, how gas overall, even though it's expensive, is much cheaper than anywhere else, even in PA. I mean, the moment you cross the border, you're looking at usually $1 or more difference.
Both are so close to everything, yet both have a reasonable cost of living. Better come take advantage of these prices before the area heats up again, baby.
All right, well, that was cool. Guess. Oh yeah, he's probably just talking more about the collaboration. Yeah, I like that a lot. Um, I as an Ohioan, definitely passionate, I guess, about Ohio more so than, in a way, even than, like, I would say, it definitely used to be more of a thing to be, like, consider yourself a part of your state before the country. Obviously back pre-Civil War, but in Ohio there's still a fair amount of that, which there is all over, but it's pretty big here, so I get it. Um, and yeah, I don't know. Obviously, I still root for Ohio as far as comparing the two, but it's cool to see how similar they are. You don't get to see that a lot. I would like to see one with Ohio and Michigan. That would be interesting. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and until next time.